It's time once again for another episode of Atlanta Legal Experts Radio, broadcasting live from the Pro Business Channel studios in Atlanta. And now, here's your host, Emily-Rowell.
Good morning and welcome to another exciting episode of Atlanta Legal Experts Radio. I am your host, Emily-Rowell with Peachtree Offices. I have Rich-Casanova here with me working in background foreground.
Yeah, I'm right here just trying to stay out of the fog this morning.
Yes. Yeah.
So, you have kind of a spotlight episode here today on a specific firm and some subject matter experts.
Yes,
and,
we actually have Taylor English in the house today.
Yeah. All right. A round of applause for those folks. Yeah. They've been here before. At least a couple of people have been. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But we're definitely spotlighting Taylor English and their higher education practice. So we're going to be focusing on that today. First, I'd like to mention my sponsors. We have 3A Law Practice Management, helping attorneys start and build their practice. We have Peachtree Offices, helping attorneys establish their practice in the Atlanta area. And we have Atlanta's own John Marshall Law School. And again, you can go to atlantalegalexperts.com, as you can every week, to see all these links to all of our sponsors. And you'll also see a summary of our show today on there in a little bit. So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to my guests.
Good morning.
And this morning I have Deborah Osborne. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here. We have Christina Moore.
Good morning.
And we have Amy Weber.
Weber.
I knew that.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And we'll have Deb Beecham with my Advocacy Center, say that 5 times fast, joining us in the studio in just a little bit. So I will go ahead and start just to talk a little bit about Taylor English first.
All right. My name is Amy Weber, and I'm a partner with Taylor English Duma in Atlanta. We are a pro-business firm. We have 120 lawyers. We have a wide spectrum of abilities and capabilities at our firm, from corporate transactional work all the way through litigation. And the practice we're here to talk about today is our higher education practice. The higher education law is generally like most businesses. You have contracts you have to enter into, you have litigation. So our expertise, just generally as a pro-business firm, really combines nicely with the higher education practice. And we are also a firm that tries very hard to, be mindful of budgets. And just like every other business, we understand that you have, in a higher education setting, you have boards of regions that you have to be responsible to. So we are able to, build a practice in a way and help our higher education clients mindful of also that the costs are always, forefront of any legal expert you're going to hire for your legal matter.
Sure. So it sounds like even though it is a big firm, you still focus on, the individual, every little small part of a big business.
That's right. And again, we want to be able to make our clients' budgets something that's always at the forefront of litigation or even a transaction, because as you know, sometimes legal costs can really skyrocket before you know it.
Right.
And we want to be mindful and partner with our clients so that they can get what they want at a reasonable cost.
Thank you. You did really well. So how long have you been with, and this is Amy Weber we're speaking with, how long have you been with Taylor English?
I've been with Taylor English for about 6 years.
Wow.
And again, business litigation.
Mm-hmm.
And I also do some commercial work with creditor rights and a little bit of bankruptcy. But again, we also do this higher ed, which is what we're here to talk about today. It's a great firm. Great people here to talk with me about it today.
And you graduated from Mercer University?
Mercer Law School, right, in 1999. I'm a California girl, so I'm not a Georgia native, but I think I fit right into the Atlanta market.
Sure. It's not hard to do.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And we also have Christina Moore with us. Good morning.
Good morning.
And tell me a little bit more about you and your practice with Taylor English.
I'm in the resort practice group, and it's focused on real estate and resort and the travel industry. But then I also have the component of the higher ed, which deals with investigations, and then also the regulatory aspect, which crosses the border of any, I think, practice area.
Sure.
Which I think is a nice way to make all the practice areas and work with a lot of people, which is very nice.
And how long have you been with Taylor English?
I think I've been there about 4 years.
Okay,
So
good. And you graduated from Loyola
yes,
University?
I'm also not an Atlanta native. I was in Chicago for undergrad and for law school. I also played soccer up there, so
Oh, fun.
I like the Title IX as it relates to soccer.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, we have Deborah Osborne. I hope I said that right.
Yes,
Osborne.
that is.
Okay, good. And you've been with Taylor English for how long?
For 5 years.
Fantastic. And you focus on the higher education, is that right?
I focus on youth-serving organizations, which covers both higher ed and then the K-12 summer camps, daycare centers, that sort of thing. Like everyone else here, I sort of overlap that with the other half of my practice is political organizations, which this is a very fun time of year to be working with those groups. But
I bet, absolutely. And you've spent 30 years working with educational and social services organizations.
I started out after I graduated from college. I was a social worker before I went to law school, and then while I was in law school, I did volunteer work, and then after I got out of law school, while I was in private practice for a while, but I was a foster parent. And also still a volunteer with youth organizations, and then spent 7 years as a federal prosecutor, prosecuting sex crimes, child abuse crimes, and then when I came back to private practice, I just stayed involved. I'm on the board of a couple of organizations here in Atlanta and then in Cherokee County where I live.
Gotcha. Ooh, did it take a while to get here this morning? Or?
So, I left at 6 o'clock.
Wow.
So, got here at 7:15. That's sort of routine for Georgia 400.
Sure. Well, we're so glad that you're here, and it sounds like everybody's going to have a lot of good things and, experience to talk about today on the show. So the topic for today is the higher education. We will be kind of focusing on the K through 12 as well. But the higher education world and everything that surrounds it, and everything that some of the hot topics that are out there today, we'll definitely talk about. And again, just to remind our listeners, you're listening to Atlanta Legal Experts Radio, and you can find us all over social media. And make sure you hashtag AL Radio.
Got it. We got it. That's a new one.
So let's start. And this is for. I'll start with Deborah. How does your legal and life experience inform your work on internal investigations?
Well, that is one of the hot topics now in higher ed and actually K-12 is the Title IX requirements because, as Amy and Christina can explain more in depth about what Title IX requires, but one of the things that we offer is doing investigations into sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination kind of cases. The U.S. Department of Education has, in the last 5 years, come out with new guidance about what schools are expected to do in dealing with those. And for many years, the default position was just turn it over to law enforcement and let law enforcement handle it. But the Department of Education in the last 5 to 8 years has made very clear that they expect schools to do their own internal investigation and to start having not only investigations but also consequences if some sort of discrimination is found. So I go back to my experience with when I was a social worker dealing with child abuse cases and as a prosecutor learning how to investigate these cases because it's not like these kind of cases are not like burglaries or car thefts where you just go in and get just the facts. With traumatized victims, you have to be very careful and very understanding in getting the facts. But at the same time, as I learned watching in child abuse cases, the pendulum swung. When I first started, I was sort of at the tail end of the thought that it never happens. We just don't have child abuse. Right. Then the pendulum swung to it happens all the times and kids don't lie. Well, we discovered kids do lie, adults misunderstand. So now the pendulum is swung back to much more of a balanced model. And we're seeing that same thing in Title IX. We've gone from let the law enforcement handle it to I think where we are now is we have to deal with it and we have to believe the victim. And I think it's going to swing back to sometimes the victim misunderstands, sometimes they have a vendetta.
There's a balance there.
There's always a balance.
Right. A very thin line, it seems like.
Right. And you have to be very sensitive of both possibilities while you're doing the investigation.
Sure, that's got to be difficult.
So it is. And that's why it takes some life experience as well as legal experience in order to be able to handle that balance.
So can one of you explain a little more about Title IX, exactly what that is? Because that's kind of what we're wanting to focus on today.
Sure. This is Amy Weber. So Title IX is a regulation that applies, and it prohibits discrimination based on sex. And as it relates to higher education, in the higher education context, it would prohibit any sexual harassment, sexual violence, forms of sexual misconduct. This would also include dating violence, stalking, cyber stalking. So what the schools are trying to do is create an environment for our young people in school that is safe and that's welcoming and that's not non-threatening as it relates to their ability to learn. And so anytime a student raises an allegation that they have been a victim of any form of this discrimination, then the schools are required to investigate that claim. And
now, would this be student to student as well?
Yep, it can be student to student.
And not just like staff to student.
Right, it can be both. And it also can be staff and staff. So, someone who's in a position of higher authority on someone who's in, a lesser authoritative position.
Sure.
So that's really the burden that's happened with the schools over the past 5 years is that they've been mandated by the Department of Education to investigate. And there's been so many changes that it's hard for the schools to keep up with what is the right protocol to put in place, the right policy to implement. And that's where we have the expertise to guide our clients as to what is the latest that's put out by OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, and the Department of Education. And we're trying to balance, it's very hard for schools because there's a lot of personnel that goes into doing these investigations. One of the benefits that our firm can provide is doing these investigations that are neutral. And so you have a third party who's not employed by the school. Well, we are clients, but we're not an employee of the school.
Right, you're non-biased.
Right, and we don't know any of the parties involved.
And I could see why they would want the school to do their own investigation because they know people a little bit better than just, a police officer coming in,
right,
not knowing anything.
And so to make sure that we're clear that the police still have to investigate if the student claims that there's been a crime that's committed, but the schools continues to have an obligation to investigate too. So you have sometimes investigations which are going on in tandem.
Sure.
And having that independent investigator where we would come in also allows the investigator the school has interests, they don't want to have outrageous numbers of incidents, but we're able to separate ourselves from the school and at the same time give the students something that they don't feel like the school is trying to sway them one way or the other. So we're able to come in and be that balance between the school and the student, which oftentimes makes the student feel more comfortable.
Sure. It's hard. Yeah. I hate that all this has to happen, but it seems like it's, as it's just a hot topic, it's almost rampant.
Right, and you read a lot about it in the papers. And I think there's two reasons. One, I think that the idea or the definition of sexual assault is very broad. And what may have happened 20 years ago, maybe someone would not have thought that it was an actionable situation.
True.
Where they needed to seek help.
Right.
Now there's been so much training and so much information that it's really raising awareness, which is a good thing.
Sure, yeah.
And you've got that pendulum that Deb was talking about earlier where, back in the day, I'll say, this wasn't happening on college campuses, and now it's swinging the other way. This yes means yes, where you have to have this affirmative consent between two individuals, which really makes almost a consensual relationship uncomfortable. And so the schools are trying to balance the pendulum and at the same time the legal ground that is involved.
Yeah. Now tell me, what legal trends do you see that schools need to pay attention to?
Well, one of the biggest issues that we see is this idea of due process. And schools, when they're doing investigation, are not required to administer due process as the term is traditionally defined in courts. So they're trying to strike a balance between getting to the truth and appropriately sanctioning the student without harming either student permanently. And it's very difficult.
There are several lawsuits quite a few lawsuits that have been filed. It's actually a growth industry for lawyers at this point, is bringing lawsuits against the schools by either a victim who feels like they've not been taken care of, or someone who's been found responsible for being a perpetrator and they feel like they were treated unfairly. And the due process claims are actually the ones that are getting the most traction right now. If the school doesn't allow some sort of discussion and pushback and hearing and opportunity for a defense by the perpetrator, or on the other hand, doesn't give the person who's claiming to be a victim, doesn't give them some sort of the same rights. It's difficult for the schools because we have been so used to just handing it off to law enforcement and following that law enforcement model. But really what we have here is sort of a civil model in the sense of two parties fighting it out. It's just instead of fighting it out in courts, they're fighting it out in the campus adjudication process. But there's still a lot at stake. There's a lot of property at stake in education and future employment and those kind of things. So again, you have to be very careful and walk the balance between giving the perpetrator all of the opportunities to defend themselves and prove their innocence, but at the same time being sensitive to the person who claims to have been traumatized.
Another issue that's come up too, or that's an ongoing discussion, is the standard of proof that's applied generally by these hearing panels and boards. And the standard of proof is preponderance of the evidence, which is basically, just a little bit over 50%. So when you're involved in these processes, students think that there has to be an absolute proof or not. Otherwise, they won't be, brought up on a violation or won't be sanctioned. But it's, just a little bit over 50%. So that's where schools are fighting when there's a sanction that's applied. A student doesn't think it was fairly applied, but all of the codes that are in place right now in higher ed, just as a preponderance of the evidence standard. So again, it's like what Debbie was talking about, that it's, we're trying to straddle, an important time in people's lives, applying a process that is not like a court process but can impact students for the rest of their life.
And we were going to talk a little bit more about the early childhood education as well. I mean, every part of this is during a kid's most important time in their life.
Right, so Title IX does apply through K through 12. And this idea of investigation hasn't gotten a lot of traction in the K through 12 arena because the incidents are fewer.
Sure.
However, I recall a story not too long ago of a child that was complained of, a sexual assault in an elementary school. And I saw it on Facebook, and the parent said, I'm kind of getting shut out by the school. And what she really needed was someone to guide her through this process, which is what we can do. And Deb can speak more to the K through 12.
It's an issue in K through 12. As with all of these things, it's hard to know sometimes whether it actually is a sexual harassment or sexual assault, or whether it's overprotective, I call them hypervigilant parents and school teachers. When you have a 7-year-old boy who kisses a girl on the cheek on the playground. It's developmentally appropriate. It's not that unusual, but unfortunately our system looks at that and says, sexual assault, sexual abuse. And so schools face these issues of is the girl traumatized? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the boy without further traumatizing him? The last thing you want to do is put an unfair label on a child.
Right.
So in elementary school, you've got all of those issues. In high school, it can be a little more clear, because by high school they're supposed to have learned a whole lot more socially acceptable procedures.
What is and what's not.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Now with special needs students, you can end up back with the same. How did they interpret it? Did they know? How do you explain to them that unwelcome is unwelcome?
Right.
But Title IX applies, again, in K-12 context, just like it does. The other thing that happens with K-12 is we have mandated reporter responsibilities, which is anytime a child under 18 has been abused, or you have reason to suspect that they may have been abused, you have to report it to law enforcement. Actually, colleges have that obligation too. It's just so very few of their students are under 18.
Sure. Well, I'm going to welcome Deb Beecham to
Hi.
the studio. Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be back. And I was excited when Emily told me you were going to be guest. And, this is, I work with a lot of professionals advocating for families and children. So I've been doing a series with Ashley Wilcott. You introduced me to Emily. So I'm excited to hear that Taylor English has this level of expertise in this arena. I didn't realize that.
We're not very good at advertising this, so we're working on that.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, no, that's great.
And one of the things I wanted to add, too, that a component of the Title IX and this whole idea, or this whole progression of the development of this area is training. And so the schools now are required to have extensive training for their students. It's much different than when I was in college. We didn't have any training, and now there's lots of training. I was at a conference recently, and they were talking about the training that the students undergo when these kids come in when they're 18, first time away from school. We're talking about appropriate boundaries. And one of the things that came up is that we're not doing enough training at the lower level. That this is the training that really a conversation should start occurring in middle school, where we talk about boundaries and what's appropriate and what's not. And Deb, I don't know, have you had any experience with requests for clients for training to these sorts of issues?
It comes up under the bullying rubric most of the time. That is the hot issue with K-12 and with youth organizations. And again, there's a lot out there that you have kids. My granddaughter told me one morning to quit bullying her, and I said, "I'm sorry, how am I bullying you?" Well, you told me this shirt and these pants don't look good together, and that hurts my feelings.
Well, you take
kids,
they
that's
take
right.
it to the extreme.
Well,
because
it's
of
just that's
the way
kids-
they're hearing everything
Right.
so
Yeah.
bad.
Kids think things very concretely, and they are taught, don't be a bully. They don't really know what that means.
Sure.
And so, again, I think the pendulum's going to swing back. The CDC has an excellent definition of what bullying is, and it involves power imbalance. It involves sustained behavior. It's not just not inviting someone to a birthday party. So there is a lot of that is happening. It's not so much, again, because you've got younger kids, this has always been the problem with teaching kids about good touch, bad touch, all of these preventive things about sexual abuse. You don't want to sexualize them too early because they don't really understand.
Right.
And you can tell them all this stuff, but they're not developmentally capable of acting
Right.
on it.
Right. I think more parents needed the education about, what's appropriate to talk about at what stage. And,
Exactly.
we have good resources available for that. Great books. And we had author Tammy Kennedy on a while back. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but her books are age appropriate for kids who have been exposed. So it's that's another good set of resources for parents.
With that, yes. Again, in high school, the schools have not done so much about boundaries. They've done a whole lot more about sex education and kids making wise choices when it comes to sex, but they have done very little about boundaries and what's acceptable and what's not.
In that age, it's so important, I think, to teach the boundaries, more so than what to use, or what not to do, or,
Exactly. And it's very difficult in our society because if you look, I joke about any movie you go to, I mean, if we flagged all of the things that would violate a yes means yes protocol, then you would have no romance movies out of Hollywood.
Well, another issue, too, is when you have these young students that go off to college that are, exposed to all kinds of different situations they had at home, including alcohol, it just kind of fuels the fire for kind of an epidemic that's just sort of rampant, that these kids don't, they have new burdens placed on them. There's alcohol involved, and it's a recipe for disaster. So what Title IX, I think, strives to do is to get an education and to make kids aware so that they don't get themselves in situations, or if they do get themselves in situations, that they know how to get out of it. And the schools are actually very good at detailing policies and procedures so that if they read it, the students will be very aware of what constitutes a violation and then what will happen. And I know Christina has done a lot of work with schools looking into policies and procedures that the schools are putting in place to try to balance all of these competing issues.
Right, and that's something very important, the policies, because the legal world is always changing. They need to constantly, you can't just finish a policy and say, great, that's going to be in place for 5 years. It's something you really have to, one, make available to your students so they can understand what the key definitions are and what constitutes an assault or those kind of things. And then also the schools have to be tasked with constantly updating and revising and making it not just legally compliant but easy to read from a student perspective who isn't a legal expert, easy to find. These are all things that relate to your policy that you have to just almost do probably every 6 months. Is this good? Is this something we need to change? Is this something we need to get someone involved to look at and make sure we're current and easy to read?
And this is something that the Office of Civil Rights actually demands of schools, that they have to have policies and procedures in place, which give step-by-step information to the students, what's acceptable, what's not, and what's going to happen if there's a violation.
And having those in place, it's not just beneficial to the students, but also the schools can, in a sense, stay out of trouble with the Office of Civil Rights. If it's in place and it's good, that keeps them, out of the eyes of the office, in good standing almost.
Can I ask a question? We talked about training the staff. Are there programs you put in place for the students?
Yes.
Like opportunities for them to learn?
Yes. All students have to go through a training usually when school starts. And there's a training that also occurs at the end, like spring semester. And then a lot of the fraternities and sororities and other social groups on campus are also doing training. So there's a lot of highlighting of this area. And the students are, some of them will probably complain that's too much. But I think that, to err on the side of caution, more is better.
Yeah,
so
I
much
agree.
different than when I went to school.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who has 2 middle schoolers going through high school, that gives me a little more peace of mind that by the time they get to college, these policies will have been adapted a little bit more. And that was my question is, when and where are the students getting the information, and are they accountable for knowing it? Do they have to sign something saying, I have sat through this class, I have read, and I do understand?
Yes. So generally what's going to happen is when they have an orientation, they're going to go through a couple processes. And then they'll usually have to watch an online video, and they're going to have to check a box, say that they watched it. And all of these statistics are reported back by the school to the Office of Civil Rights. And this is part of the compliance proof that the school gives to the Office of Civil Rights that they are following the guidelines set forth in Title IX for education, because the schools are under an obligation to educate us to this issue.
Yeah, it sounds like we do have the pendulum going pretty hard in that direction, but it also sounds necessary. I don't have a problem with that.
Well, it's just a balance, because
Yeah.
what's happening is that I think there's a rush to judgment,
Right.
and some of these students that are respondents perhaps may not be getting a fair opportunity to explain. But this is what we talked about earlier with due process, and also the preponderance of the evidence standard. It's just different in schools. And and what's most important is, I think, if you're a parent, you need to understand so your child knows when they go to school, it's not a court. I was explaining to my middle schooler yesterday when something happened in class. I said, you don't get due process. They're not interested in what you know. They're interested in what they observed. And I think that students think that they have all these rights, but they don't when it comes to some of these processes. They just need to be aware.
So you learn how to manage your emotions and guide your behavior accordingly. And so if you know where the boundaries are, then...
And as a high schooler, that's really easy to do.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. No
well,
problem.
and it's I think the pendulum will eventually swing back, because all of these rules that we have now. I was joking about the Hollywood romance movies, but it's not the way that human relationships work. Very, very few human relationships require explicit discussion of everything.
Right.
And all of us who are in relationships know there's a whole lot of unspoken understanding that goes on. And then the due process issue, yes, schools want to stay out of trouble from the Office of Civil Rights, but on the other hand, they don't want to get sued for lack of due process. Another area that is moving really quickly also is the free speech area, that's another potential lawsuit that schools have to worry about, because the Office of Civil Rights, and Christina and Amy can explain the breadth of the definition of sexual assault includes verbal assaults, which gets into hate speech and speech codes. But for government schools, you have First Amendment free speech, which says people have an absolute right to say obnoxious things to each other. And it's a violation of law to penalize people for saying obnoxious things. You can stop them from saying dangerous things, but you can't stop them from saying obnoxious things. So that is another one of those issues that schools have to navigate between a whole lot of competing interests and motivations.
Talk about if a school actually has a claim, what are some of the first steps they need to do to deal?
If a student files a claim that they think they're a victim that falls under a victim of violence or assault that falls under Title IX, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to go to the Title IX coordinator at their school, and every school is required to have a Title IX coordinator. And this Title IX coordinator is going to explain the process. They'll do the intake with determination of summary of the facts, find out about the name of the other student, and then interim measures will be put in place depending on the nature of the incident. And then after that initial intake, then the school begins the investigative process. Well, it's like a fact finding, like you do in a civil lawsuit or a criminal matter.
And that's the point they need to call us.
Yes, I would say so. I would absolutely say so.
So they do the fact finding, and the fact finder, as we are the neutrals, all we're doing is we're making a determination as to whether there is a violation of Title IX and the school policy. The normal traditional model is that the fact finder or the investigator makes that determination, and then the matter is turned back over to the school, to the dean of students, and then there's usually a student hearing board or some sort of hearing board, which can be comprised of either faculty or a hybrid of faculty and students, and then the matter is taken to a hearing, and then there's an adjudication on that hearing, and then there's an outcome or a sanction if applicable.
Got it.
Wow. Under that, how does the claim get started? The schools at the initial training point are going to be informing their students, here's our policy, here's where you go to file a claim, because students also have to have the ability to do it anonymously, because there's so many aspects of what goes on in these incidents that you don't want your name out there, or you're not comfortable. You're only comfortable doing it anonymously. So the school's going to have, hopefully a very good, detailed website page just focused on this, where you can get their policy, where you can file a claim, where you can do all these things without having to put your hand up in front of everybody at first. Right. And that's something hopefully the student learns about at the initial part of the training when they come into school.
Yeah, the schools will maintain confidentiality to the extent that they can, and there are other federal laws that would prohibit disclosure of student names. So, it's just like every other process. There are so many competing interests, and then the respondent, he or she wants to have his, their fair opportunity to explain the situation and scenario. So when interim sanctions are put in place, it can sometimes involve students not coming onto campus except for only for classes. And it also can mean moving the students from different dorms if they're uncomfortable. I mean, there's a real emphasis on making sure that the victim is not feeling as if they have to be re-traumatized every time they see the respondent.
Especially in such a sensitive issue.
Yes.
Right, and then you're also having to balance that both students can still get their education. So you don't want to re-traumatize, but you also don't want to say you're a semester behind, because that affects the rest of your life. And so these are, kind of big issues that can affect long-term items in your personal life.
And you can see, too, for a school whose main goal is to educate, these are very difficult issues that schools face every day.
Is there any education with students in the training about consequences for making false claims?
Yes, there are usually student honor code violations that will accompany. But again, that's another process they have to go through. So instead of a Title IX hearing, they'd be going through a student code violation hearing. But that does happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, we see that all through life, in business and family court. And
the Duke lacrosse case is a very obvious example. That was not a student there, but those students, I think their parents had to remortgage their houses in order to pay for the attorneys. So there is a lot at stake. I think actually the model that law enforcement has developed for dealing with child abuse cases is very informative here, because whenever a child reports something, or whenever there's a mandated report by the school, it goes to specially trained investigators, but it also, you pull in the child advocacy centers, which do a wraparound with counseling and help with social services, pull in funds for the non-offending parent or options for the non-offending parent. And with that wraparound in the way of dealing with it, it meets the due process requirements, but it also limits how much you're going to re-traumatize the child while you're doing the investigation. So I think colleges could learn from that process with, and obviously K-12 could access that process of doing the wraparound with counseling and the support and the advocate as the victim is going through the adjudication process.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that's something the public could stand to hear more about, how that process actually works, because if you are a parent whose child makes an outcry, you're not prepared for what that process looks like, and you're so busy responding, emotionally and out of fear, that if you don't understand how the process works, things can break down. But that it is a really good process, and I've seen this play out in multiple cases, and they really do a great job. The forensic evaluators and
the child advocacy centers. That's all. Whenever I have parents calling me with those issues, and we walk them through it, I always call your child advocacy center and plug into the resources they have there, and then we'll start from there.
Yeah. Well, and there's also a lot of training that goes on with for investigators, and is to be able to figure out when a person is responding to questions. Not everybody who's been traumatized responds the same way.
Exactly.
And the way that they might respond may believe the investigator to believe nothing happened, because you have, as you know, you have people who are in trauma who may laugh and who may exhibit a range of emotions that would be very to someone who
Right.
wasn't in the process thinks that's an odd reaction.
Right.
So I've gone through some training with the Georgia State Patrol, and they are actually very in tune on these issues, and they too are going through training with respect to how to interview victims. And
That's really good to know.
yeah, and the range of emotion that can be displayed, and not to discount any emotion that showed as an evidence of untruth. And there are some statistics out there that say that it's a very low percentage of people who have not been victimized for them to not tell the truth. I think it's between 2 and 8%.
Right.
It may not be to the extent that they're describing, but something happened.
Exactly. That's what I see too.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and this is such a big subject, and just an hour just goes by so quickly. Any final thoughts?
I don't know if I have a final thought. My final thought is just this is a hot topic, and there's so many different things that come into play that I think it's important for students, parents, universities, lawyers. I think there's so many people that are touched by this that in different ways that I think it's something everyone should be paying attention to. Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
And when you're developing a policy, there's, again, you have to worry about being sued. You have to worry about losing funding from Department of Education. Georgia House Committee just recently had hearings on this issue, threatened to pull funding if they don't get more due process obligations. Schools in Georgia are now under investigation by the Department, Office of Civil Rights, Department of Education. There's a lot at stake, and it takes some concentrated effort to navigate all of the potential pitfalls here.
And I've had a lot of guests. A lot of the guests on here are single practice, small practice firms, but I see the importance of having a large firm to be able to go through. I mean, we barely touched on the little, the different subjects and things that we have to be aware of, and to have professionals like Taylor English to really go through that with the schools,
Right.
is really important.
Yeah, and that's what we have a deep bench so that, these areas can touch constitutional law, civil law, and we pride ourselves on being able to navigate very easily through any legal claim that comes up. And so that we would encourage our clients to be proactive, look at your policies, review your policies. Do you think they're in line? When was the last time they were reviewed? What is the latest and greatest from the Office of Civil Rights? And, do you have enough training for your staff, for your students?
Yeah, so let's talk about Taylor English's contact information. It's probably pretty easy.
Yes. So we can be found at www.taylorenglish.com. My name is Amy Weber, and I'm in their business litigation department. You can email me at aweber@taylorenglish.com.
And that's WEBER.
That's right, 1B.
And not Weber.
And not the girl people either.
I'm CMOORE at taylorenglish.com.
And just look me up on the website. My last name is Osborne, but it starts with an A.
Yeah,
So it's AUSBURN.
And Deb?
Yes, Deb Beecham, and if you go to myadvocatecenter.com, there's a contact form there, and usually respond within 24, 48 hours. And
For any parents that are listening.
yeah, parents, professionals, legislators. I've been asked to put together a CLE course. So there's all kinds of room for consulting. Big area. But
Yes.
it's great to meet you all, and look forward to following up.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all your contributions today. This is Emily-Rowell with Atlanta Legal Experts Radio, signing out.
Thank you again for joining Emily-Rowell and her guests on the Pro Business Channel. Use the social media links here to share today's show, and stay tuned for the next episode of Atlanta Legal Experts Radio.